and they cannot be separated. Okay. So now looking at emotional development more specifically, in units 1 and 2, you look at the development of very young children mostly, and you are expected to know a few theories and be able to discuss them. So this is where you start to need to remember a little bit more, but we'll hopefully get through it together, as I'll try to go into a lot of detail and recap some of these concepts. So, emotional development is the process of psychological development, emotional, cognitive, and social, over the course of the lifespan. As stated by Vika, obviously, you need to remember all of this information. There's nothing on the slides that is not accessible that I've put on for today. So, first, we need to be able to define attachment, because this is what Ainsworth and the Strange Situation will be about. Attachment is the emotional bond that occurs between an infant and their main caregiver or caregivers. So, usually the parents, usually the mother. I'm sure this is a familiar word to everyone, and you will even know about the types of attachment, or at least have heard about them in terms of slang terms, often used even on social media. But essentially, attachments are formed during infancy and persist later on into the child's life, and they are crucial for the infant's short-term and long-term emotional development, and their attached type of attachment to their caregiver will determine later aspects of their life. Okay, so when we look at Ainsworth and the Strange Situation, this is a study that was conducted by the American psychologist Mary Ainsworth, that was named The Strange Situation. Okay, so it's a procedure devised by Ainsworth in the 70s to try to observe attachment in children, uh, the relationships with a caregiver and a child. She conducted it with children between the ages of 9 to 30 months, so really young children and infants. And the attachments, and she used it to identify attachment styles, which we will look at, and you need to be able to discuss these in questions. Um, there was a fourth category that was introduced on top of all of the others, and this one you'll need to know about in a little bit more detail. It's called the disorganized attachment. And this led to the development of the attachment theory, thanks to Ainsworth. So, in the procedure of the strange situation, the child is observed playing for 21 minutes, while caregivers and strangers as well take turns entering and leaving the room, recreating the flow of the unfamiliar and familiar presence in the children's lives. The situation was created to vary in stressfulness for different groups of children in the study, and the child's responses were observed. So, what situations were experienced by the children? First of all, the infant and caregiver were taken into a strange room with some toys, and then there was multiple stages to the study. So, first, the parent and infant were introduced to that experimental room and playing together alone. The parent was told not to participate while the infant explores. Then a stranger enters and talks to the caregiver, and then the stranger approaches the infant while the parent just leaves. So the first separation episode is when the stranger's behavior is geared to that of the infant. Okay. And that's when the stranger joins the infant. And then following that, there's a episode called the first reunion episode, where the parent or caregiver comes back, greets and comforts the infant, but leaves again. So that leads to a second separation episode where the infant is alone, the stranger comes back again, um, and and causes again more stress to the infant. by offering that comfort. Finally, again, the parent enters again, greets the infant, picks them up while the stranger leaves. So the things that they were trying to observe as part of this study, this convoluted study, was the amount of exploring or playing the child would engage throughout, especially when the stranger was there in comparison to the parent. Because obviously the level of playfulness in the child indicates how comfortable the child is and how the child actually feels in that situation, okay? Also observe were the child's reactions to the caregiver leaving and how much anxiety when the stranger was around and how the child would behave when reunited with the caregiver. So based on these four observed behaviors and these results, um, the three types of attachment were identified, and later we said Ainsworth added the fourth, the disorganized, that we'll also discuss. So first of all, the secure attachment was 65% of the 1-year-olds in the study. And this is where the infant has a really healthy balance between dependence on the caregiver and exploration. So a child who's securely attached to its parent would explore and play freely while the caregiver was present in the room and use them as a sort of secure base from which they could explore. So they would be completely relaxed. The child would also engage with the stranger when the caregiver was present and might be upset when the caregiver left, but they would be happy to see the caregiver on their return every single time. The child would feel confident that the caregiver is available, is trustworthy, and will respond to their needs and communications. So securely attached children would be best able to explore and play when that caregiver is present and they trust them and they feel safe. Um, Whenever assistance is given, it enhances that infant's level of security and trust with their caregiver. And these help to educate children to cope with problems in the future. They begin to have a healthy coping style with secure attachment. Next, we have the insecure avoidant attachment. It's also called the anxious avoidant insecure. And this is where this was only 20% of the 1-year-olds in the study. This is where infants will not seek contact with their caregiver and will treat them much like a stranger. Unfortunately, it can be the result of hostile care, including aggression or just not responding to the child's needs. But a child with anxious, avoidant, insecure attachment can avoid or even ignore the caregiver and show very little emotion when they depart or return and come back. They also will not explore very much, regardless of who is there, whether that's the stranger or the caregiver. They're not likely to play very much. And this is in the study where they wouldn't show any distress when the caregiver leaves, and they would either ignore the caregiver when the caregiver comes back into the room during the study, or they would ignore and turn away when they came back, one or the two. They might show some tendency to approach them, but they would be very cautious. So this is, they think, hides distress, and that can be potentially of the experiences and potential hostile care that they may experience. So the last type before we get into the disorganized attachment is the insecure resistant attachment. This was 12% of the 1-year-olds involved in Ainsworth's study. And this is where infants appear anxious when their caregiver is around, but become very upset when separated. The infant, for example, might be crying to be picked up, but after they are picked up, they may be trying to squirm free. Um, so these children showed distress even before the separation from the caregiver during the experiment, and they were clingy and difficult to comfort on the caregiver's return. They showed potentially signs of resentment in response to the absence, or signs of helplessness and being really passive. Um, so this type of attachment is still unclear, but it's been also classified as a response to unpredictably responsive caregiving. So the difference between insecure avoidant and insecure resistant is where we said there might be hostile care, like leaving the baby to cry every day, for example, resulting in insecure avoidant attachment. In insecure resistant attachment, it may be inconsistent care. So one day the baby's left to cry, the other day the other time it's crying, the parent comes and comforts the baby. So it's unpredictably responsive. So what the infant tries to do in this case is to maintain the availability of the caregiver by preemptively taking control of that interaction, by keeping that distance but still keeping the caregiver close. So as we can see, both types of insecure attachment are no good, and infants with secure attachment are much more likely to be self-confident and have more successful relationships as an adult. Now, lastly, having a look at disorganized attachment. It is the fourth type of attachment that Ainsworth much later identified in 1986. So, when in the strange situation, the infants would show odd and often even contradicting behaviors when being reunited or separated from their caregivers. For example, when an infant was reunited with a caregiver, they might be trying to seek contact by crawling towards that caregiver that has come back, but at the same time avoiding eye contact and turning their head away. Or they were producing bizarre behaviors like rocking back and forth when the caregiver returned. So, disorganized attachment was linked with factors such as postnatal depression. So, if the mother has a baby and has depression after giving the birth while caring for the child, and just as our insecure attachments, a link to hostile care was identified. However, it can also be seen in the typical families that are perceived not to have any problems. So inappropriate parenting is not always the reason. So we can say that it may be a part of the child's nature, if we're going back to the nature versus nurture debate, to show that level of caution. Okay. So ultimately, secure attachment is the most common, and it is the one that we want to see in children, leads to a confident, happy, able to cope with everything, stable relationship sort of adult. And insecure avoidant, insecure resistant, all and disorganized, all composed of those bizarre, unhealthy attachments that may be linked to trauma during infancy as well. Um, an insecure avoidant attachment may mean that when the infant grows up into an adult, um, they will also exhibit these patterns. They will distance themselves from people due to mistrust. An insecure resistant may show their attachment but keep their distance, you know. And disorganized attachment may continue to exhibit bizarre, inconsistent behaviors in their personal relationships.